Chris was born in Dowagiac, Michigan on June 13, 1950, and his parents were Jim and Vera Taylor. He has two sisters, Sherry, and his younger sister, Becky. And he spent his whole life in Dowagiac going to school. He was always a bigger child than the rest of the kids.
What I remember most about Chris when we were young and were kids in school and that was his demeanor, his easygoing nature. He went along with being picked on constantly because he was such a big guy and never let it bother him. He let everything kind of roll off his back, and thank God he had a good nature, I guess, because if he didn't, somebody would have got hurt.
Wrestling shaped him as a person. He wrestled in high school, and one time Coach Lewis, his high school wrestling coach, told the story about how he was working out and his father came in and called him over. He said something to Chris, and Chris says, "I've got to go, Coach. I didn't do my chores." And my dad says, "I've got to go home and finish my chores before I can go to wrestling practice." So his coach didn't bat an eye. He just says, "Okay, Chris, we'll see you later." So he grew up in a pretty structured house where, everybody had their chores, everybody had to look out for each other. The first time I ever met Chris was at Muskegon Community College, and the class he was in had just let out. I had gotten out of my class, and here was this big guy standing with this letter jacket with a D on, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I can still remember it to this day. And I'm thinking, D, what town is he from? D, and all I could think about was Detroit. Who would have ever thought of a small town called Dowagiac? Anyway, I was also in the gymnasium the same time he was, so we got to know each other back and forth. Chris was somewhat very shy in a way with me. He didn't know what to say sometimes, and he would talk me into doing some things that I never thought I could ever do, and then I talked him into doing some things that he thought he could never do or thought he'd never want to do. And so he was quite shy, but he had an image that people thought he should be loud and vociferous, so sometimes he played that image, not for himself, but for others. But life has always been interesting with him, and we were very compatible with it. We just played off each other if it needed to be that way, or we just worked it together. You just had to have a lot of patience and a lot of understanding where everybody was coming from. Because sometimes they would look at Chris and not look at me, and that's how I always tell people when they say, "Oh, I didn't know you were married to Chris," and I usually say, "That's because I stood behind him." If Chris was here right now and was able to say thank you to anyone, I know the first people he would think would be his parents, who stood up with him, for him, and supported him every inch of the way of his career. And I know he was always very proud of his parents, and I know his parents are very proud of him. And I think he would like to thank all the coaches that he had through high school, junior college, and in the Olympics, for all their hard work, for getting after him to make sure that he did what he was supposed to do. And and some of the partners he had, that wasn't easy being his partner.
I've often told people this, that without Dan Gable, I could not have won the NCAAs. As a student at Iowa State University. Without having Chris on the team my senior year, the year before I went to the 72 Olympics, I could not have won the Olympics. After I was done training with Chris, I was not afraid of any Soviet wrestler.
Chris comes over one night, and I was sitting on the mat. He comes over one night and he says, "Coach," he says, "you wrestle everybody in the room but me." He says, "and you even wrestle the other heavyweights." And he nudged me off of my rear onto my hands and knees in referee's position. And I committed an error because when he did that and got himself on top of me, he was in a perfect side roll position. And I side rolled him to his back. He said something to the effect of, "Oh, Coach, you shouldn't have done that." So he comes off his back and he's on me chest to chest. And my next great move was trying to breathe. One thing about Chris, I think people thought Chris's success was involved with just his size and his weight, and they did not realize that Chris was an all-around athlete. He could shoot a double leg like a middleweight. The only difference was because of his size and his height is that his opponent thought he was taking flying lessons. We did have to take him over to the meat lab to weigh him because the normal scale we had only went to 300 pounds. No doubt some of the enemy probably thought of him as a big fat guy. And he had some excess weight, but he had power. But he never abused it. Never practice room, competition, socially. Everybody on that team liked Chris. And I'm glad that he was a part of my life.
Chris, did wrestle both ways. He's the only American to actually make a team and wrestle in the same Olympics, both styles. Chris did a good job. Of course, we're all prejudiced, but I think Chris, if he'd been wrestling anybody other than Medved, Medved would have been cautioned out or certainly lost several caution points. Medved was able to get one good takedown, and then the referees really let him. Of course, he was going for his third Olympics, but Chris did, wrestle an awesome tournament. He wound up with a bronze medal, and again, I think he would have also ended up with at least a bronze and possibly won it had he gotten past the match with Detriech when he got caught and thrown. Chris was wrestling a good match, and Detriech knew he couldn't last with him the whole match, but he made the desperation throw, and it worked, and it's one of the most classic throws I've ever seen. In all fairness to Chris, they could have called Detriech pinned because he sunk in a big, thick mat about 2 inches when he hit, but he had the momentum to roll over on top.
Chris and I were only married for 5.5 years, and it may have been a short marriage in some aspects, but it was pretty deep, and we did a lot of things together, and we had one beautiful child, and I am just blessed that he came into my life, and he's such a wonderful person. If you knew him at all, you know what I'm talking about. He was always there for you and to help everybody.
It means a lot to me that he's being recognized for his accomplishments. He's been gone for a very long time, and so it's amazing that at this time, about 30 years later, that he's being still recognized and still acknowledged for those accomplishments. And so it's very important, and it's very exciting for me and my family to be going through all of this.